On a stormy night in June 1886, Bavarian King Ludwig II, the famed Mad King who built Neuschwanstein Castle, met an untimely and mysterious end. Late on June 13th, 1886, Ludwig's body was found in the shallow waters of Lake Starnberg, just south of Munich, alongside the corpse of his personal physician. His death was officially ruled to be by his own hand, with him drowning himself, a conclusion reached after only a cursory examination. Yet from the very beginning, doubts plagued the official story. Over the next century, the bizarre circumstances of King Ludwig's death would prompt multiple investigations and fuel a host of conspiracy theories. In early June 1886, political intrigue was swirling around King Ludwig II. The eccentric monarch had alienated his ministers with his extravagant castle building and withdrawn lifestyle. This led them to conspire in having him declared mentally unfit to rule, despite him being a quite popular monarch. On June 10th, 1886, a government commission arrived at Ludwig's fairy tale palace of Neuschwanstein to deliver his deposition. The next day, Ludwig was arrested and transported to Berg Castle, a lakeside estate that had been converted into a makeshift psychiatric holding place for the now deposed king. Dr. Gooden, the prominent psychiatrist who had certified Ludwig as insane without a personal examination, assumed responsibility for the monarch's custody and treatment. By the evening of June 13th, Ludwig had been a prisoner at Berg Castle for barely 24 hours. What happened on that fateful night would soon become the stuff of legend. On June 13th, 1886, at around 6:30 p.m., King Ludwig and Dr. Gooden set out for a stroll through the Berg Castle parkland along the shore of Lake Starnberg. Dr. Gooden oddly insisted that no attendants accompany them, a decision that left the vulnerable ex-king alone with his doctor as dusk fell. When the pair failed to return by 8 p.m. as expected, concern grew. A search party of the castle's staff and guards fanned out in a gale-driven rainstorm, combing the darkened shoreline by lantern light. It was around 10:30 p.m. when the horrified searchers finally spotted two figures in the water near the shore. King Ludwig and Dr. Gooden were found floating in waist-deep water, their heads and shoulders above the surface. Ludwig's pocket watch had stopped at 6:54 p.m., suggesting the king's fate was sealed shortly after the start of their walk. Despite efforts at resuscitation, both men were cold and lifeless when pulled from the lake. The Bavarian authorities lost no time in declaring a cause of death. Following a brief on-site investigation and examination of the bodies, officials announced that King Ludwig II had ended himself by drowning in the lake. Further, they found that Dr. Gooden perished attempting to save the king, a story which would be built upon by the authorities. However, almost immediately, the evidence refused to line up neatly with this explanation. An autopsy on Ludwig's body revealed no water in his lungs, a finding starkly at odds with him intentionally seeking his demise by drowning. Observers noted that the water at the recovery site was only waist-deep, and that Ludwig, an excellent swimmer, should have been able to stand up or save himself if he were conscious. In fact, his body was found with his head and shoulders well above the waterline, making the drowning claim even harder to accept. Curiously, Ludwig had not expressed any intent to end himself, despite the crisis that led to his removal. Meanwhile, Dr. Gooden's corpse told a violent tale. The 62-year-old doctor was found with blows to his head, bruises, and strangulation marks on his neck. His glasses were broken and there were scratches on his face, signs of a desperate struggle. The king's body, by contrast, showed only a scrape on one knee, and no visible wounds or trauma. So this may have you asking the obvious. If the official story says Ludwig had drowned on his own accord peacefully, how did they explain the savagery visited upon Gooden? The official story held that the Mad King must have attacked his doctor in a fit of insanity while the doctor was trying to rescue him. But the story didn't stop there. The official narrative quickly became that Ludwig had actually slain his personal physician in a fit of rage. As Ludwig's body was hurriedly interred in Munich with minimal delay, whispers began that the true story was being covered up. From the outset, the Bavarian government's handling of the case fueled public skepticism. Rather than invite transparency, officials moved to shroud the incident in secrecy. The members of the search party, including the king's footmen and a fisherman involved in recovering the bodies, were all sworn to silence by order of a government minister. They took oaths never to speak of what they had seen or knew. And curiously, they were ordered not to discuss anything related to it even to a priest. For context, Bavaria was and remains a highly Catholic region of Germany, making such an oath extremely unusual. Such an extreme gag order struck many as suspicious, even at the time. If the deaths were as straightforward as they were claimed to be, why permanently muzzle everyone tangentially involved in the investigation? Further, why would people be forbidden from taking part in confession in relation to the investigation, and why would they need to confess anything to begin with? This climate of official secrecy only encouraged rumors. Indeed, within days of the tragedy, Ludwig's loyalists and ordinary Bavarians alike began to voice doubts about the official narrative. The idea that the former king would slay a man and then drown seemed both out of character and conveniently tidy for the same ministers who had just ousted him. Many started to suspect foul play, and after all, he had been the victim of a political coup on the basis of his mental health. It didn't escape notice that those who benefited most from Ludwig's demise were the very figures behind his deposition, including his uncle Prince Luitpold, who assumed the regency. For historical context, Prince Luitpold would effectively be the ruler of Bavaria for nearly 30 years, after Ludwig was replaced with King Otto. Notably, King Otto was completely mentally incapable and could be easily controlled by the prince. And yes, this does clearly call into question a major element of why this case continues to fascinate scholars and the public. Why remove Ludwig for being potentially mentally incapable while not doing the same for Otto, who was definitely mentally incapable? In this tense atmosphere, alternative theories about what really happened on the night of June 13th began to take root and multiply. Before long, a consensus formed among Ludwig's supporters that the king had been slain. One dark conjecture is that conspirators decided to eliminate Ludwig quietly once he was in custody. In fact, local fishermen reported hearing gunshots ring out across Lake Starnberg that night, an ominous detail that doesn't fit a drowning scenario. This gave early credence to the notion that unknown assailants might have been lying in wait. Some have speculated that two sharpshooters hid in a lakeside boathouse and, under cover of stormy darkness, eliminated both men. The motive was to prevent the deposed monarch from ever regaining power or rallying his supporters to his cause. Such claims remained speculative for decades due to a lack of concrete evidence. But as time went on, bits of testimony and hidden documents began to surface, keeping alternative theories alive and well. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence to emerge is the secret account of Jacob Little, King Ludwig's personal fisherman. Little was part of the search party on the night of June 13th, and it was from his boat that the bodies were ultimately discovered. Bound by the official oath of silence, Little never spoke publicly about what transpired. However, before his death in 1933, he left behind private writings describing a very different chain of events from the official version. Decades later, these notes came to light through his family, and their content is explosive. Little claimed that the king had been attempting to escape that night. According to Little's account, a rescue plan was in motion, and he had been retained by loyalists to get the king to safety. The fisherman had hidden his boat among the lakeside bushes, ready to ferry Ludwig to safety across the lake. From there, he was to be taken by loyalists to Austria, where his cousin Elizabeth was the empress. The fisherman knew nothing further of the plans of the loyalists. However, one can only imagine the international incident this would have sparked. The Kingdom of Bavaria was part of the German Empire, and Austria was an important ally of this newly united empire. Having the king of one of the constituent kingdoms of the empire building a power base in a neighboring country would obviously be problematic diplomatically. But let's get back to what the fisherman himself actually knew and witnessed. According to Little, Ludwig was shot as he stepped into a boat, and Gooden was struck while he remained on the shore. Little was able to flee successfully but was sworn to secrecy. Notably, a handwriting expert who examined the surviving pages of Little's diary in 1961 judged them to be authentic, suggesting this account was indeed written by the fisherman himself. That said, handwriting analysis can be quite problematic, and some have expressed doubts about the veracity of the fisherman's writings. Notably, not every historian or modern investigator subscribes to the sharpshooter theory. One hypothesis is that Ludwig did die during an escape attempt, but not in accordance with the previous account. Instead, he may have succumbed to a medical emergency brought on by the cold lake water. The night was chilly and the lake was very cold, and some have suggested the king suffered a heart attack or stroke during his frantic swim for freedom. In this scenario, Ludwig's collapse in the water could explain his death without drowning, consistent with the autopsy finding of empty lungs. Dr. Gooden's injuries might then be attributed to a confrontation on shore when he tried to stop Ludwig from fleeing. Another theory focuses blame on Dr. Gooden himself. It was known that Gooden carried sedatives and had boasted of techniques to subdue violent patients. One account holds that Gooden brought a bottle of chloroform on the walk. The chloroform could have rendered Ludwig unconscious, causing him to fall into the water and perish while partially incapacitated. Under this theory, it's speculated that Gooden tried to get him out of the water, which led to him sustaining injuries while the king flailed at him. According to this theory, Gooden then might have suffered a fatal heart attack from the shock or exertion, explaining why he too died in this circumstance. Still, others support the official theory, despite the substantial inconsistencies with it. In the end, though, every proposed scenario has its inconsistencies, and this 19th century mystery will likely never be fully solved. Ambrose Bierce was a larger-than-life figure in late 19th century America. Born in 1842 and raised in Indiana, he survived combat as a young Union soldier, an experience that left an indelible mark and shaped the dark, unflinching tone of his writing. After his time in the Army, Bierce became a journalist and author in San Francisco, where his razor-sharp wit and merciless satire earned him the nickname Bitter Bierce. He was celebrated for such works as An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and for The Devil's Dictionary. By 1913, Bierce had a hard-won reputation as a brilliant but cynical man of letters. He was known for skewering the powerful and exposing corruption in print. Yet behind the public persona lay personal tragedy and weariness. His marriage had ended in divorce, and 2 of his children had perished, leaving him largely alone in his old age. In his 70s, he remained intellectually vigorous, but had grown deeply disillusioned. Rather than slipping quietly into retirement, Ambrose Bierce chose to embark on one last grand adventure. In the autumn of 1913, after settling his affairs, Ambrose Bierce set off from Washington, D.C. on a journey that would be his last. He toured parts of the states, including where he fought as a Union soldier, almost as a farewell pilgrimage through the landscapes of his youth, before heading toward Mexico. He passed through New Orleans and Texas, crossing the Rio Grande into Chihuahua by late 1913. At that time, Mexico was in the throes of revolution, and the northern states were engulfed in fighting between rebel forces and the regime of President Victoriano Huerta. The famed revolutionary general Francisco Pancho Villa was leading a rebel army in the north, and Bierce aimed to find him. Many friends were alarmed that a man in his 70s would ride into an active conflict zone, but Bierce wouldn't be deterred. To friends and family, he explained that he wanted to see what was really going on in Mexico for himself. He informed them that he was thinking about writing a book based upon what he planned on seeing. As he traveled south, Bierce sent letters home that revealed his grim sense of humor about what might await him. In one letter, he joked that if he ended up, quote, stood against a Mexican stone wall and shot to rags, he would consider it a pretty good way to depart from life. Dark as it was, he apparently meant what he said. By December 1913, the 71-year-old Bierce had crossed into northern Mexico and caught up with Pancho Villa's army. He reportedly met the rebel leader and even witnessed the Battle of Tierra Blanca, one of Pancho Villa's major engagements that fall. From the city of Chihuahua on December 26, 1913, Bierce wrote a final letter to a close friend. In it, he casually noted, quote, "I leave here tomorrow for an unknown destination." That unknown destination would mark the end of his story. After that letter, Ambrose Bierce vanished without a trace. By early 1914, when no more letters or news came from Bierce, speculation about his fate began to spread in the press and among the public. In the absence of any confirmed account, historians and enthusiasts have put forward several theories to explain what might have happened to the famed writer. One leading theory is that Bierce died in the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. In fact, in early January 1914, Villa's troops stormed the border town of Ojinaga in a major battle against Mexican federal forces. If Bierce was present during that fight, or a similar skirmish, he could have been struck down by a bullet or shell during combat. Should he have fallen on a remote battlefield, news of his death might simply never have made it back to the United States. In that case, the old warrior-turned-writer would have met the end he seemed to seek. Another possibility is that Bierce was captured and eliminated. Some accounts claim that Pancho Villa became suspicious of the American in his midst. According to one story, Bierce mentioned leaving to meet one of his adversaries, which prompted Pancho Villa to order him slain as a potential spy or turncoat. Alternatively, Bierce might have fallen into the hands of Mexican federal troops, who could have summarily eliminated him as a potential foreign spy. Others believe he may have essentially fallen victim to a roving group of bandits eager to exploit the chaos of the Mexican Revolution. Another suggestion is that Ambrose Bierce's grim sense of humor, combined with his very limited understanding of Spanish, could have led to an unfortunate misunderstanding. Of course, in the ruthless environment of that revolution, any of these grim scenarios is plausible. A very different theory suggests Bierce succumbed to illness or injury while trying to return home. Decades later, locals in the Texas border town of Marfa told of an old American who perished from pneumonia in early 1914 after crossing north from Mexico. This man supposedly called himself Ambrosia and spoke of having written books. According to one of the people who met him, he had even mentioned one with the word devil in the title. According to this account, he succumbed to pneumonia and was buried anonymously on Texan soil. If this story is true, it remains possible that his remains may one day be discovered in a pauper's grave in Marfa. Of course, the mystery of Ambrose Bierce's fate has also inspired some more unlikely legends. Some claim that he deliberately staged his own disappearance, in essence to write a real-life mysterious final chapter for himself. Under this theory, he may have lived out the remainder of his life in Mexico, or he may have made his way further to the west, with some speculating that he settled in Arizona. Despite countless investigations and wild tales, more than a century has passed without any definitive proof of Ambrose Bierce's ultimate fate. Tokyo, July 1949. 4 years into the Allied occupation, the summer sun beat down on a city still scarred by conflict. On the morning of July 5th, a black limousine pulled up outside Nihonbashi's Mitsukoshi department store. Out stepped Sadanori Shimoyama, the president of the Japanese National Railways Corporation, who told his driver to wait as he walked into the store. He was supposedly shopping for a birthday gift for his wife, but he never returned. Just after midnight, his body was found on the railroad tracks on the city's outskirts. Was this the result of a desperate act by a man under unbearable pressure, or the result of a sinister plot by any number of actors looking to consolidate power in the lean years of the occupation? By 1949, Japan was experiencing growing strains under the Allied occupation. The early post-war push for democracy had given way to Cold War anxieties. American authorities under General Douglas MacArthur and Japanese leaders grew fearful of the rising Japanese Communist Party and labor union militancy. Strikes and protests were on the rise, prompting a reverse-course crackdown that curtailed union rights. The Japanese Communist Party's unexpected leap in parliamentary seats that year only heightened these fears. At the same time, the economy was in crisis. That year, the occupation forces prescribed a harsh austerity program to curb inflation. This budget cut public spending and wiped out thousands of jobs, and one of its first targets was Japan's sprawling national railway. On July 4, 1949, Shimoyama, just weeks into his new job as JNR president, announced the dismissal of 30,000 employees virtually overnight. This was a reduction ordered by occupation authorities to both save on costs and also weaken communist influence in the labor force. Shimoyama was deeply distressed by the mass layoffs and had even received anonymous threats from those enraged by the cuts. This was the volatile backdrop against which he set out for work on July 5th. That morning, Shimoyama left home as usual, heading to the office, but he never arrived. Around 9:30 a.m., he asked his chauffeur to stop at Mitsukoshi department store in central Tokyo, then stepped out and disappeared into the crowd. Despite his driver waiting for hours, it was the last confirmed sighting of him. When Shimoyama missed his meeting and couldn't be found by late afternoon, a frantic search began. News of the missing railway chief spread quickly, and the public was stunned that such a powerful figure could vanish in broad daylight. Unconfirmed reports later surfaced of a man resembling him seen wandering the city that day, but none could be verified, and as night fell, the mystery deepened. In the early minutes of July 6th, the worst fears were realized. Around 12:30 a.m., a train driver on the Joban line spotted something on the tracks between Kitasenju and Ayase stations. It was a human body, and investigators soon identified the remains as Shimoyama. Japan woke up to the shocking twist that the missing railway president had been run over by his own train. The authorities launched an intensive investigation, with U.S. occupation officers working alongside Tokyo police. But from the outset, they encountered baffling clues. One medical examiner at the scene initially suggested that Shimoyama might have leaped in front of the train, implying he had committed the act intentionally. Yet the formal autopsy swiftly contradicted that idea. It found that Shimoyama had died before being run over. Notably, very little blood was found around his mangled body, indicating his heart was not beating at the moment of impact. In other words, he may have been slain elsewhere, and his corpse laid on the tracks to be crushed to bits by the next train. That said, there's another potential explanation for this evidence that also potentially makes sense, which I'll get to in a moment. Despite months of effort and scores of detectives on the case, police were unable to crack the mystery. Every lead turned into a dead end, and no witnesses could definitively place Shimoyama with anyone, or explain how he ended up where he did that night. There was no note either from himself or from abductors, and no obvious suspect. In the politically charged atmosphere, the police kept their findings close to the vest and never officially announced any conclusion. In 1964, 15 years after the fact, the statute of limitations expired with the Shimoyama case still unsolved, and the case was officially shut, without any real sense of closure. Over the ensuing decades, several theories have endured. The first theory suggests that he did it himself. Under this view, Shimoyama broke under the immense pressure and guilt of his job. He'd been tasked by the occupation authorities with putting tens of thousands out of work and faced vilification and threats. It's conceivable that by July 5th he saw no other way out. To this day, many consider this a plausible explanation. However, this doesn't necessarily explain why the autopsy findings indicated that he was already dead while on the tracks. That said, there's no indication that any toxicology test was conducted, and some have speculated that he may have taken a lethal dose of a substance prior to going to the track. Under this theory, Shimoyama, who was a conscientious man, didn't want to burden the train operator with the guilt of being the responsible party. That said, he wanted to send a message loud and clear about why he committed the act. So under this theory, he had to have his body mangled by one of his trains. Of course, this doesn't explain why he didn't leave a note or tell anyone that this was his intention. This point does lead down another rabbit hole as well, since some have speculated that a note was found. The contents of this speculative note are of course completely unknown, but it's been suggested he may have blamed the occupation authorities, or even issued support for trade unionists. Under this theory, this note would have had a destabilizing effect, and it was suppressed for political reasons, which of course brings me to those reasons. Another line of speculation blames communists for the attack. In 1949, suspicions immediately fell on those most enraged by the JNR layoffs. Perhaps, it was argued, vengeful fired workers under the direction of the Japanese Communist Party activists abducted Shimoyama as payback. This idea was eagerly embraced by U.S. occupation officials and Japan's government at the time, who pointed to a communist plot. In fact, the Shimoyama incident became a pretext for cracking down harder on leftist unions and the Communist Party. The climate of the era lent some significant weight to the theory that the communists were behind this action. While the Japanese Communist Party would renounce violence and revolution in 1955, in 1949 they still saw themselves as a revolutionary vanguard group set on overthrowing capitalism directly. Further, given the harsh conditions of the era, as mentioned, they had experienced significant electoral success as well. There were also indications that the Shimoyama incident may have been part of a broader campaign against the railway infrastructure. Within weeks, two other mysterious rail disasters, a runaway train at Mitaka and a derailment at Matsukawa, were blamed on alleged communist saboteurs. Although those cases later fell apart for lack of evidence, they reinforced the narrative that extremists were undermining Japan's railways. Notably, others have proposed that those subsequent events were caused by the massive layoffs, which potentially cut crucial personnel. Some others have contended that anti-communist elements, perhaps Japanese ultra-nationalists in an unholy alliance with American occupation forces, orchestrated the incident. According to this theory, The conspirators kidnapped Shimoyama and made it look like communists did it, in order to turn public sentiment against the left. While no direct proof has ever emerged, the idea of an occupation-era cover-up continues to intrigue people. The Shimoyama incident was never solved, but it left a lasting mark on Japan. Observers have since called Shimoyama's death a pivotal moment in the occupation era, one that profoundly altered Japan's political trajectory. In its immediate aftermath, the authorities used the incident to accelerate a purge of communists and their sympathizers from positions of influence. Thousands lost their jobs, including hundreds of railway workers identified as troublemakers. In the end, Shimoyama's unsolved death became known to history as the Shimoyama Incident because of this outsized impact on Japanese history. In fact, the case can be made that it had an outsized impact on world history, since there was a realistic possibility in 1949 of Japan fracturing much like Korea did. Only after this incident, and the subsequent train incidents, was the communist influence in Japan largely quelled.